Welcome, traveler, to Wild Cowboy Tales, where the dust of the plains holds stories of grit, gunpowder, and the ghosts of yesterday. Tonight, we tell a tale of a woman forged in the fires of vengeance, a daughter whose love for a forgotten father set a town ablaze. This is the Outlaw's daughter's revenge. The dust of Redemption Gulch settled on everything, a fine, ochre powder that coated the lungs and clung to the soul. For 18 years, it had been the taste of Clara James's life, the grit between her teeth a constant reminder of the town that had chewed up her father and spat him out at the end of a rope. She was a phantom in her own home, the daughter of a name no one dared speak, a ghost haunting the periphery of a town that had collectively decided to forget. Her father, Jedediah James, had been a man of contradictions. The town elders, men like Judge Sterling and Sheriff Brody, had painted him as a devil incarnate, a ruthless outlaw who rode into their peaceful valley with chaos in his wake. They spoke of him in hushed, fearful tones, a boogeyman to frighten children and a cautionary tale for anyone who dared step out of line. But Clara remembered a different man. She remembered the calloused hands that had patiently taught her how to track a jackrabbit, the low, rumbling laugh that had filled their small log cabin on stormy nights, and the fierce, protective love in his eyes whenever he looked at her. He was a man who had stolen from the rich to give to the poor, a Robin Hood of the arid plains who had seen the rot festering at the heart of Redemption Gulch and had dared to challenge it. His crimes, as they were called, had been acts of defiance against the suffocating grip of the cattle baron, Elias Thorne, a man whose wealth had bought the law and whose ambition had bled the small ranchers dry. Jedediah had wrestled Thorne's cattle, not for personal gain, but to feed the families that Thorne was systematically starving out. He had robbed the stagecoaches carrying Thorne's ill-gotten profits, distributing the money among the dispossessed. He was a hero to the downtrodden, a symbol of hope in a desperate land. But in the end, Thorne's gold had spoken louder than the gratitude of the poor. Clara had been just a child, only 7, the day they hanged him. The memory was a shard of glass in her mind, eternally sharp and painful. She remembered the jeering crowd, their faces twisted in a righteous fury that had been carefully stoked by the town's powerful men. She remembered the cold, impassive gaze of Judge Sterling as he read the verdict, his voice a death knell in the oppressive afternoon heat. She remembered Sheriff Brody, a man her father had once called a friend, tightening the noose around his neck with a grim, almost apologetic finality. And she remembered her father's last words, his voice clear and unfaltering as it cut through the din of the mob. "You can kill me," he had roared, his eyes finding hers in the crowd, "but you can never kill the truth." They had buried him in an unmarked grave at the edge of town, a final, petty act to erase his existence. His name was stricken from the town records, his existence wiped from the official history of Redemption Gulch. It was as if Jedediah James had never been. But Clara remembered. She remembered every story he had told her, every lesson he had taught her. In the long, lonely years that followed, the memory of him became her religion, his quest for justice her sacred vow. She grew up in the shadow of the gallows, an outcast in a town that had celebrated her father's death. Her mother, a woman broken by grief and fear, had withered like a flower in the unforgiving sun, dying only a few years after her husband. Clara was left to fend for herself, a scrawny, feral child with her father's fiery spirit and her mother's haunted eyes. The other children, echoing the sentiments of their parents, had taunted her, their cruel words a constant reminder of her tainted bloodline. Outlaws spawn, they would sneer, their childish malice a reflection of the town's festering hypocrisy. But the ostracism had forged her in a way that acceptance never could. It had made her tough, resilient, and fiercely independent. She had learned to read people, to see the greed and fear that lurked behind their pious masks. She had learned to survive in the harsh and forgiving wilderness that surrounded Redemption Gulch, her father's lessons in tracking and hunting becoming her means of survival. And, most importantly, she had learned to shoot. Her father had left behind an old, pearl-handled Colt peacemaker, a beautiful and deadly instrument that had been his constant companion. He had taught her the basics, his large hands guiding her small ones as she learned to aim and fire. After his death, the gun became an extension of her will, a symbol of her unspoken promise. She spent countless hours in the desolate canyons, the sharp crack of the Colt echoing off the rock walls as she honed her skills. She became a phantom shot, her speed and accuracy rivaling that of the most seasoned gunslingers. The gun was her only friend, her only confidant. Its cold, hard steel a comfort in the long, empty nights. As she grew into a woman, her hatred for Redemption Gulch and the men who had orchestrated her father's death grew with her. A venomous snake coiled in her heart. She watched as Elias Thorne's empire grew, his herds of cattle swallowing up the small ranches that had once dotted the valley. She saw Judge Sterling dispense his justice, always in favor of the rich and powerful, his gavel a hammer that shattered the hopes of the poor. She observed Sheriff Brody, a man consumed by his own guilt and weakness, turn a blind eye to Thorne's brutalities, his badge a tarnished symbol of a law that had been corrupted. The town, in its collective amnesia, prospered. New buildings went up, saloons and brothels flourished, and the illusion of a thriving, respectable community was carefully maintained. But beneath the surface, rot remained. The poor were squeezed ever tighter, their lands and livelihoods stolen by Thorne's insatiable greed. The law was a tool of oppression, and justice was a commodity to be bought and sold. Redemption Gulch had forgotten Jedediah James, but it had embraced the very corruption he had fought against. Clara knew she couldn't let it stand. The memory of her father demanded more. The truth he had spoken with his dying breath deserved to be heard. She was no longer a frightened child, but a woman with a purpose, a ghost from the past ready to claim a debt of blood. The time for hiding in the shadows was over. The time for revenge had come. She spent months meticulously planning her return, every move calculated and precise. She gathered information, listening to the loose talk of drunken cowboys and disgruntled ranch hands. She studied the habits of her enemies, learning their routines, their weaknesses, their fears. She was a hunter stalking her prey, patient and relentless. Her first target was Silas Croft, Thorne's cruel and sadistic foreman, a man whose brutality was the stuff of legend. It was Croft who had led the posse that had captured her father, his snarling face a permanent fixture in her nightmares. He was the first domino she would topple, the first crack in the foundation of Thorne's empire. One sweltering afternoon, as the sun beat down on the dusty streets of Redemption Gulch, Clara rode into town. She was a striking figure, a woman of harsh and dangerous beauty. Her long, dark hair was braided down her back, her eyes the color of a stormy sky. She was dressed in men's clothing, practical and unadorned, but the pearl-handled Colt that hung at her hip was an unmistakable statement of intent. She moved with a liquid grace, a predator in her natural environment. The townspeople, the same ones who had shunned her, now watched her with a mixture of curiosity and unease. They didn't recognize the gaunt, haunted child she had once been. They saw only a stranger, a woman who exuded a quiet and deadly confidence. The whispers started, a low buzz that followed her as she made her way to the saloon. The saloon was a den of iniquity, the air thick with the smell of cheap whiskey, sweat, and desperation. It was here that Silas Croft held court, his booming laughter and profane boasts a testament to his arrogance. He was a mountain of a man, his face a roadmap of barroom brawls and broken promises. He sat at a corner table, surrounded by his sycophants, a king in his squalid kingdom. Clara walked straight to the bar, her steps measured and deliberate. She ordered a whiskey, her voice low and even. She could feel the eyes of the entire room on her, the silence descending like a shroud. She took a slow sip of the liquor, the fiery liquid of familiar comfort. Then she turned, her eyes locking with Croft's across the crowded room. "Silas Croft," she said, her voice carrying a chilling authority. "I have a message for you." Croft, taken aback by her audacity, let out a guffaw. Well, well, what have we here?" "A pretty little thing with a big voice." "What's the message, sweetheart?" "It's from Jedediah James," she replied, her voice barely a whisper, but a whisper that echoed in the sudden, deathly silence of the saloon. The name, and spoken for so long, hung in the air like a hangman's noose. Croft's laughter died in his throat, his face paling beneath his sun-bronzed skin. He hadn't heard that name in 18 years, but he had never forgotten the man who had worn it. "Who are you?" he stammered, his bravado gone. "I'm his daughter," Clara said, her hand hovering over the butt of her Colt. "And I've come to collect a debt." In that moment, the years of pain, of rage, of a burning need for vengeance, all coalesced into a single, blinding point of focus. The past was no longer a ghost, but a living, breathing entity, a force of nature about to be unleashed on the unsuspecting town of Redemption Gulch. The outlaw's daughter had come home, and hell had come with her. The echo of a hanged man was about to become a deafening roar. The silence in the saloon was a physical thing, a thick, suffocating blanket that smothered the usual boisterous din. Every eye was fixed on the woman at the bar, a ghost from a past they had all conspired to bury. The name she had spoken, Jedediah James, was a curse, a forbidden word that had been banished from the town's vocabulary. To hear it now, spoken with such cool, deliberate intent, was like a dagger to the heart of their carefully constructed peace. Silas Croft, a man who had built his reputation on fear and brutality, found himself, for the first time in a long time, afraid. He saw the ghost of Jedediah in the woman's eyes, the same unyielding defiance, the same unwavering conviction. This wasn't just some woman looking for trouble. This was a reckoning. "You're bluffing," Croft growled, his hand inching towards the pistol at his hip, but his voice lacked its usual blustering confidence. It was thin and reedy, a pale imitation of his customary snarl. Clara's lips curved into a faint, mirthless smile. "Am I?" she asked, her voice a silken threat. "Your men ambushed my father. 5 against 1. A coward's tactic for a coward's cause." Her words were a direct challenge, an accusation that cut through the years of lies and self-deception. The men at Croft's table shifted uncomfortably, their faces a mixture of guilt and apprehension. They had been there that day, part of the posse that had hunted Jedediah down like an animal. They had gloried in their victory, basking in Thorne's praise and the town's adulation. But now, in the face of this avenging angel, their triumph felt hollow, their courage a sham. He was an outlaw, Croft spat, his voice regaining a fraction of its familiar venom. He got what he deserved. What he deserved was a fair trial, Clara shot back, her voice rising with a righteous fury. Not a kangaroo court presided over by a corrupt judge and a bought-and paid-for sheriff. What he deserved was justice, not a mob baying for his blood. Her words struck a painful chord of truth that many in the saloon had long suppressed. They had all been part of that mob, their fears and prejudices fanned into a hysterical frenzy by Thorne's inflammatory rhetoric. They had cheered as Jedediah swung from the gallows, believing they were witnessing the triumph of law and order. But in the quiet moments of the night, in the dark, hidden corners of their souls, they had known. They had known they had been part of a great and terrible injustice. "The past is the past," Croft said, his eyes darting around the room, as if seeking support from the silent onlookers. But he found none. The faces that stared back at him were filled with a dawning horror, a collective sense of guilt that was slowly rising to the surface. "Maybe for you," Clara said, her voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "For me, the past is a debt that's long overdue. And I'm here to collect." With a speed that was almost inhuman, her hand became a blur, the pearl-handled Colt appearing in her grasp as if by magic. The sharp, metallic click of the hammer being cocked was the only sound in the deathly quiet room. Croft, in the midst of his own clumsy, slow-motion draw, froze, his hand hovering uselessly over his holstered pistol. "You have a choice, Croft," Clara said, her voice as cold as a tombstone. "You can tell me everything you know about the day my father was captured. You can tell me who gave the orders, who pulled the strings. Or you can die with your secrets." Croft's face was a mask of terror. He looked to his men for help, but they were as paralyzed as he was. They were thugs and bullies, accustomed to preying on the weak and defenseless. They were no match for the righteous fury that stood before them. I don't know anything," he stammered, his bravado completely shattered. "Liar," Clara hissed, her finger tightening on the trigger. The tension in the room was a taut wire, ready to snap at any moment. The patrons of the saloon, a motley collection of cowboys, prospectors, and drifters, held their breath, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination. They were witnessing something they had never seen before, a woman standing up to the most feared man in town, a woman who seemed to have no fear of death. Then, just as the confrontation reached its breaking point, the saloon doors swung open, and Sheriff Brody stepped inside. He was a man in his late 50s, his face etched with the weary resignation of a man who had long ago compromised his principles. He had been a young, idealistic lawman when he had first come to Redemption Gulch, but the town, and Elias Thorne, had slowly and systematically broken him down. He was a shadow of his former self, a man haunted by the ghosts of his past. He took in the scene at a glance, the armed woman, the terrified foreman, the silent, watching crowd. A flicker of something, perhaps a long dormant spark of the man he had once been, kindled in his eyes. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "This is a private matter, Sheriff," Clara said, her eyes never leaving Croft's. "There's no such thing as a private matter when a gun is drawn in my town," Brody replied, his hand resting on the butt of his own pistol. "Your town," Clara scoffed, a bitter, contemptuous sound. "This isn't your town, Brody. It belongs to Elias Thorne. You're just his errand boy." The sheriff flinched as if she had struck him. Her words were a cruel and accurate assessment of his situation, a truth he had been trying to deny for years. He had sold his soul for a tin star and a semblance of authority, and the price had been his self-respect. "Put the gun down, girl," he said, his voice more of a plea than a command. "Not until he tells me what I want to know," Clara said, her resolve unshaken. Brody looked at Croft, then at Clara. He saw the desperation in the foreman's eyes and the unyielding determination in the woman's. He was caught between a rock and a hard place, between his duty to Thorne and a sudden, unexpected urge to see justice done. "She's Jedediah James's daughter," Croft blurted out, his voice filled with the desperate hope that the sheriff would save him. Brody's face went pale. The name was a ghost from his own past, a constant, nagging reminder of his greatest failure. He had been there at the gallows, a silent and complicit participant in a legal lynching. He had never forgiven himself for his cowardice, and the guilt had been a cancer in his soul for 18 long years. "Jedediah's daughter," he whispered, his eyes filled with a mixture of awe and fear. "Yes," Clara said, her voice softening slightly. "And I know you were his friend once, Brody. I know you know the truth about what happened to him." The sheriff's face contorted, the years of guilt and shame finally breaking through his carefully constructed facade. He had been Jedediah's friend, had shared drinks and stories with him, had respected and admired the man's courage and conviction. And he had stood by and done nothing as Thorne and his cronies had destroyed him. I couldn't do anything," he stammered, his voice choked with the self-loathing that had festered for nearly 2 decades. "You can do something now," Clara said, her voice a quiet plea. "You can help me expose the truth. You can help me bring the men who murdered my father to justice." For a long moment, Brody was silent. He was a man at a crossroads, a man being offered a chance at redemption, a chance to reclaim the honor he had so carelessly thrown away. He looked at Clara, at the fire in her eyes, at the unshakable strength of her resolve. He saw in her the ghost of his old friend, a reminder of the man he had once been, the man he could be again. With a long, shuddering sigh, he made his decision. He unbuckled his gun belt and let it fall to the floor. "I'm not Thorne's dog anymore," he said, his voice filled with a newfound strength. "Tell me what I need to do." The serpent had begun to uncoil. The first thread of the conspiracy that had choked the life out of Redemption Gulch had been pulled, and the entire rotten tapestry was about to come undone. The outlaw's daughter had found her first ally, and the battle for the soul of the town had just begun. The air in Sheriff Brody's office was thick with the dust of old files and the bitter scent of stale coffee. It was a small, cluttered space, a testament to years of neglected duty and compromised justice. For Brody, it had been a cage, a gilded prison where he had served out his sentence of self-loathing. But now, with Clara James sitting across from him, her presence a catalyst for a long overdue reckoning, the office felt different. It felt like a war room. Croft, stripped of his gun and his bluster, sat huddled in a corner, his fear a palpable thing. He had been a big man in a small pond, his power derived from the fear he inspired. But in the face of Clara's righteous fury and Brody's unexpected defection, he had shrunk, his authority dissolving like morning mist. "Talk," Clara commanded, her voice allowing for no argument. And so, the story spilled out, a torrent of names, dates, and sordid details that painted a damning picture of the conspiracy that had led to Jedediah James's death. Croft, his voice trembling, confessed everything. He told of how Elias Thorne, in his insatiable greed, had coveted the land of the small ranchers, the very land that Jedediah had sworn to protect. He revealed how Thorne had used his wealth to buy Judge Sterling, a man whose gambling debts had made him an easy target for corruption. He detailed how Thorne had orchestrated a series of outlaw attacks, all designed to frame Jedediah and turn the town against him. Brody listened, his face a mask of grim resignation. He had suspected much of this, had seen the pieces of the puzzle but had been too afraid to put them together. Now, to hear it all laid bare, the full extent of his own complicity washed over him, a tidal wave of shame and regret. The final piece of the puzzle, Croft said, his voice barely a whisper, was the stagecoach robbery. The one that sealed Jedediah's fate. Clara leaned forward, her eyes boring into him. What about it? It was a setup, Croft confessed, his gaze fixed on the floor. Thorne had one of his own men, a hired gun named Lefty Malone, stage the robbery. He made sure the stage was carrying a shipment of Thorne's gold, and he made sure there were witnesses who would swear they saw Jedediah leading the raid. And where is this Lefty Malone now? Clara demanded, her voice dangerously quiet. Thorne paid him off, sent him away, Croft said. I heard he's holed up in a mining town a few days' ride from here, a place called Devil's Anvil. Clara stood up, her decision made. Brody, I need you to keep Croft here, under guard. Don't let anyone know he's talking. I'm going to Devil's Anvil. You can't go alone, Brody said, a newfound sense of responsibility in his voice. It's a dangerous place, filled with killers and cutthroats. I've been dealing with killers and cutthroats my whole life, Clara replied, a wry, mirthless smile touching her lips. Besides, I work better alone. The ride to Devil's Anvil was a journey through a desolate and unforgiving landscape. The sun beat down with a relentless intensity, the air shimmering with heat. The land was a harsh and brutal place, a fitting backdrop for the town that bore its name. Devil's Anvil was a collection of ramshackle buildings clinging to the side of a barren mountain, a place where men came to seek their fortunes in the gold mines and, more often than not, found only their graves. Clara rode into town with the setting sun at her back, the long shadows of the mountains stretching out before her like grasping fingers. The town was a chaotic and lawless place, the streets filled with a rough-and-tumble collection of miners, gamblers, and gunslingers. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, cheap whiskey, and desperation. She found Lefty Malone in the town's only saloon, a grimy, smoke-filled establishment called the Devil's Due. He was a weaselly man, with shifty eyes and a nervous twitch. He was playing poker, his cards held close to his chest, his face a mask of sweaty concentration. Clara approached his table, her presence a sudden and unwelcome intrusion. Lefty Malone, she asked, her voice cutting through the din of the saloon. Malone looked up, his eyes widening in alarm at the sight of the woman standing before him. He didn't know who she was, but he could see the danger in her eyes, the deadly purpose in her stance. Who's asking? He stammered, his hand instinctively going to the gun at his hip. A ghost from your past, Clara said, her hand a blur as she drew her Colt and pressed the barrel to his forehead. I want to talk about a stagecoach robbery that happened in Redemption Gulch 18 years ago. Malone's face went white. He had thought that part of his life was buried, the blood money he had taken from Thorne a secret he would carry to his grave. But the past, it seemed, had a long and vengeful memory. The saloon erupted in a chaos of screeching chairs and panicked shouts as the patrons scrambled to get out of the line of fire. In a matter of seconds, the room was empty, save for Clara, Malone, and the terrified bartender who was hiding behind the bar. I don't know what you're talking about, Malone said, his voice a pathetic whine. Don't lie to me, Clara said, her voice as cold as the steel of her gun. I know Thorne hired you to frame Jedediah James. I want a signed confession. I want you to write down everything you know, every detail of Thorne's plan. Malone, his life hanging by a thread, quickly agreed. With a trembling hand, he scribbled out his confession on a piece of parchment, his signature a shaky, almost illegible scrawl. No sooner had he finished than the saloon doors burst open and a group of armed men stormed in. They were Thorne's men, sent to Devil's Anvil to make sure Malone kept his mouth shut. Thorne, it seemed, had a long reach. The gunfight was a maelstrom of smoke, fire, and the deafening roar of pistols. Clara, using the overturned poker table as cover, was a whirlwind of deadly efficiency. Her Colt barked and spat fire, each shot finding its mark with unerring accuracy. She moved with the grace of a dancer, a phantom in the swirling chaos of the saloon. When the smoke cleared, Thorne's men lay dead or dying on the floor, and Lefty Malone was gone, having slipped out the back door in the confusion. But Clara had what she had come for. The confession, clutched in her hand, was a weapon, a piece of irrefutable evidence that would expose Thorne's lies and bring his empire of deceit crashing down. The dance with the devil had begun, and Clara James was leading the charge. She was no longer just a daughter seeking revenge. She was a force of justice, a symbol of hope for a town that had forgotten the meaning of the word. The road ahead was still long and treacherous, but for the first time, she could see a glimmer of light at the end of the tunnel. The truth was coming, and it was coming with a vengeance. Clara rode back into Redemption Gulch under the cold, indifferent gaze of 1,000 stars. The desert night was a symphony of silence, a stark contrast to the chaos of the gunfight in Devil's Anvil. The signed confession from Lefty Malone was tucked safely inside her shirt, a tangible piece of the truth she had been chasing for so long. It was a small victory, a single battle in a much larger war, but it was a start. It was proof that the monolithic edifice of lies that Thorne had constructed was not impenetrable. It had cracks, and she was determined to shatter it. As she rode, the whispers of the past swirled around her, carried on the cool night breeze. She thought of her father, of the stories he had told her of a time before Thorne, a time when Redemption Gulch was a community of equals, a place where people helped one another, where justice wasn't a commodity to be bought and sold. He had believed in that ideal, had fought and died for it, and now, it was her turn to carry the torch. She reached Redemption Gulch just as the first pale light of dawn was breaking over the eastern mountains. The town was still asleep, its secrets and lies hidden beneath a blanket of peaceful slumber. She went straight to the sheriff's office, her heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and trepidation. Brody was waiting for her, his face etched with worry. He had spent a long, sleepless night, wrestling with the ghosts of his past and the uncertain future that lay ahead. The sight of Clara, alive and unharmed, brought a wave of relief. "You made it," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I did," she replied, pulling out Malone's confession. "And I have this." Brody read the confession, his eyes widening with each damning word. It was a detailed account of Thorne's treachery, a roadmap of the conspiracy that had destroyed a good man and corrupted a town. "This is it," he whispered, his voice filled with a newfound sense of hope. "This is the proof we need." But Clara knew it wasn't that simple. Thorne was a powerful man, his influence extending far beyond the borders of Redemption Gulch. A piece of paper, even one as incriminating as this, wouldn't be enough to bring him down. They needed more. They needed to turn the town against him, to awaken the sleeping conscience of the people who had been so easily swayed by his lies. "We need allies, Brody," she said, her voice firm and determined. "We can't do this alone." Their first stop was the local newspaper, the Redemption Chronicle, a small, struggling publication run by a man named Samuel Finch. Finch was a man of principle, a rare commodity in Redemption Gulch. He had always been suspicious of Thorne, had tried to investigate the cattle baron's shady business dealings, but had always been met with a wall of silence and intimidation. They showed him Malone's confession, and the old newspaperman's eyes lit up with a righteous fire. "I knew it," he said, his voice trembling with a mixture of excitement and indignation. "I knew there was something rotten at the heart of this town." He agreed to publish the confession, to print a special edition of the Chronicle that would expose Thorne's crimes to the entire valley. It was a risky move, one that could cost him his business, and possibly his life, but it was a risk he was willing to take. The truth, he believed, was worth fighting for. Next, they went to the local doctor, a man named Elias Vance. Dr. Vance was a kind and compassionate man who had been treating the poor and disenfranchised for years, often for no pay. He had been a close friend of Jedediah James and had never believed the official story of his death. He listened to their story, his face a mixture of sadness and anger. "I always knew Jedediah was a good man," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "And I always knew Thorne was a snake." He offered them his support, his home becoming a safe haven for their clandestine meetings, a place where they could plan their next move without fear of being overheard. He also had a network of contacts among the small ranchers, the very people who had been hit hardest by Thorne's tyranny. The whispers on the wind began to grow, to coalesce into a murmur of dissent. The special edition of the Chronicle hit the streets like a thunderclap, its headlines screaming the truth that had been suppressed for so long. The people of Redemption Gulch, confronted with the irrefutable evidence of Thorne's treachery, began to question the lies they had so readily accepted. The small ranchers, emboldened by the doctor's support and Clara's courage, began to organize. They held secret meetings, their anger and frustration finally finding a voice. They were tired of being pushed around, of having their lands and their livelihoods stolen by a man who had no regard for the law or common decency. Clara, the outlaw's daughter, the one who had been shunned and despised, was now a symbol of hope, a catalyst for a revolution. She spoke at their meetings, her words a powerful and eloquent call for justice. She told them stories of her father, of his courage, of his unwavering belief in the power of the people. She reminded them of the community they had once been, the community they could be again. But Thorn was not a man to be underestimated. He had built his empire on a foundation of fear and intimidation, and he was not about to let it crumble without a fight. He hired a new set of enforcers, a ruthless gang of gunslingers led by a man named Black Bart Corrigan, a killer whose reputation was as dark as his name. The town became a powder keg, the tension between Thorn's men and the increasingly defiant townspeople a palpable thing. There were skirmishes, barroom brawls, and whispered threats in the dead of night. The whispers on the wind had become a gathering storm, and it was about to break over Redemption Gulch with a fierce and cleansing fury. The stage was set for a final, bloody confrontation, a battle for the soul of a town that had forgotten its name. The name Jedediah James, once a whispered curse, was now a rallying cry. It was spoken in hushed tones in the back rooms of saloons, in quiet conversations between neighbors, in the defiant declarations of the small ranchers who had finally found the courage to stand up to Elias Thorn. For 18 years, the town had been suffocated by the weight of a lie, but now, with the truth finally coming to light, it was as if a fresh wind was blowing through the dusty streets of Redemption Gulch. For Clara, this transformation was both exhilarating and terrifying. She had returned to her hometown with a single purpose, to avenge her father's death. But her personal vendetta had blossomed into something much larger, a popular uprising against a tyrant. She was no longer just the outlaw's daughter, she was a leader, a symbol of resistance. And the weight of that responsibility was a heavy one. She found herself haunted by the ghost of her father, not as a specter of vengeance, but as a moral compass. What would he have done in her position? Would he have approved of the path she had chosen, a path that was sure to lead to more bloodshed and violence? He had been a man who fought for justice, but he had also been a man of peace, a man who had resorted to violence only as a last resort. These questions gnawed at her, a constant, nagging presence in her mind. She had been so consumed by her hatred for Thorn and his cronies that she had never stopped to consider the moral implications of her actions. Was she really any different from the men she was fighting against? Was she using the same tactics of fear and intimidation that they had used to control the town for so long? The weight of her own name, Clara James, also began to feel like a burden. She was the daughter of an outlaw, and that stigma, she feared, would forever taint her actions, no matter how noble her intentions. Would the people of Redemption Gulch ever truly trust her, ever see her as anything other than the spawn of a man they had been taught to despise? These doubts and fears came to a head one evening as she sat in Dr. Vance's study, the flickering light of an oil lamp casting long shadows on the walls. She was surrounded by her allies. Brody, his face now etched with a quiet determination, Finch, the newspaper man, his pen now a weapon as mighty as any gun, and a handful of the most trusted ranchers, their faces grim but resolute. They were planning their next move, a daring raid on Thorn's main ranch, a plan to scatter his herds and cripple his financial empire. It was a bold and dangerous plan, one that would almost certainly lead to a violent confrontation with Black Bart Corrigan and his hired guns. As she listened to the men discuss the details of the raid, a wave of revulsion washed over her. This wasn't justice. This was war. And she was the one leading them into battle. "Stop," she said, her voice a sudden and jarring interruption. "We can't do this." The men fell silent, their faces a mixture of confusion and surprise. "What do you mean, Clara?" Brody asked, his brow furrowed with concern. "This is our chance to strike a real blow against Thorn." "And then what?" she demanded, her voice trembling with a passion that surprised even herself. "We burn his ranch, we scatter his cattle. And in return, he unleashes his dogs of war on this town. More people will die. More families will be torn apart. Is that the kind of justice my father would have wanted?" The room was silent, the men speechless. They had been so caught up in the righteous fervor of their cause that they had failed to consider the consequences of their actions. My father was not a killer, Clara continued, her voice filled with a raw and painful emotion. He was a man who fought for the little guy, a man who believed in the power of community, of people standing together against injustice. He would not want his name to be used as an excuse for more violence, for more bloodshed. She stood up, her eyes blazing with a newfound conviction. "There has to be another way," she said, her voice ringing with a desperate hope. "A way to bring Thorn down without destroying this town in the process." And so, they went back to the drawing board, their focus shifting from a military-style raid to a more strategic and, ultimately, more powerful weapon, the law. Brody, his knowledge of the legal system rusty but not forgotten, began to pore over the old town records, searching for a legal loophole, a forgotten statute. Anything they could use to challenge Thorn's claim to the land he had stolen. Finch, the newspaperman, began to write a series of articles, not just about Thorn's crimes, but about the history of the town, about the ideals on which it had been founded. He wrote about Jedediah James, not as an outlaw, but as a hero, a man who had fought and died for those very ideals. Clara, for her part, began to do something she had never thought possible. She began to talk to the people of Redemption Gulch, not as a leader, but as a neighbor. She listened to their stories, their fears, their hopes. She shared with them her own story, her own pain, and in doing so, she began to build bridges, to heal the wounds of the past. The weight of her name, she realized, was not a burden, but a gift. It was a reminder of her father's legacy, of the principles for which he had lived and died. And she would honor that legacy, not with a gun, but with the truth. The fight for Redemption Gulch was far from over, but the nature of the conflict had changed. It was no longer a simple story of revenge, but a complex and nuanced struggle for the soul of a community. And Clara James, the outlaw's daughter, was finally ready to bear the weight of her name. Elias Thorn was a man accustomed to control. He had built his empire on a foundation of fear, intimidation, and a carefully cultivated illusion of invincibility. For 18 years, he had been the undisputed king of Redemption Gulch, his word law, his will absolute. But now, for the first time, he felt the foundations of his kingdom begin to crumble. The whispers on the wind had become a roar, a chorus of defiance that echoed through the once subservient streets of his town. The special edition of the Redemption Chronicle, with its damning expose of his crimes, had been a body blow, a direct assault on his carefully constructed reputation. And the arrival of Clara James, the ghost of a past he thought long buried, was a personal affront, a challenge to his authority that he could not ignore. He sat in his opulent study, a room filled with the spoils of his ill-gotten gains, and fumed. The walls were adorned with the heads of animals he had hunted, their glass eyes staring down at him with a silent, accusatory gaze. He had always been the hunter, the predator. But now, he was the one being hunted, and he didn't like it one bit. His first instinct was to crush the rebellion with brute force, to unleash Black Bart Corrigan and his hired guns on the town, and make an example of those who dared to defy him. But his new, more cautious lawyer, a slick, silver-tongued man from the city named Marcus Kane, had advised against it. A frontal assault would be a mistake, Mr. Thorn, Kane had said, his voice as smooth and oily as a snake. It would only make a martyr of the girl and galvanize the opposition. We must be more subtle, more strategic. And so, Thorn had reluctantly agreed to a more insidious approach, a campaign of psychological warfare designed to divide and conquer the growing resistance. He began by targeting the most vulnerable, the small ranchers who had been the backbone of the rebellion. He called in their loans, foreclosed on their properties, and used his control over the local water rights to cut off their supply, leaving their crops to wither and die in the unforgiving sun. Then he turned his attention to the townspeople, using his wealth and influence to create a climate of fear and suspicion. He spread rumors, sowed seeds of discord, and turned neighbor against neighbor. He offered bounties for information, turning the town into a hotbed of spies and informants. His most cunning move, however, was to target Clara directly, not with a gun, but with a smear campaign designed to destroy her reputation and turn the people against her. He had Finch's newspaper office vandalized, its printing press smashed to pieces. He bribed witnesses to come forward with false testimony, painting Clara as a violent and unstable woman, a worthy successor to her outlaw father. The storm that had been gathering on the horizon was now a full-blown tempest, a whirlwind of lies, deceit, and intimidation that threatened to tear the town apart. The once unified front of the rebellion began to show signs of cracking. The ranchers, their livelihoods threatened, began to waver. The townspeople, their fears and paranoia fueled by Thorne's propaganda, began to look at Clara with suspicion and distrust. Even Brody, the once resolute sheriff, began to feel the pressure. He was a man of the law, and he found himself in the untenable position of having to enforce Thorne's unjust edicts. He was caught in a moral no-man's land, his loyalties torn between his duty to the law and his commitment to Clara and her cause. Clara, for her part, felt the full force of the storm. She was being attacked from all sides, her every move scrutinized, her every word twisted and used against her. The weight of her name, which she had only just come to accept, now felt like a millstone around her neck. She was being judged not for who she was, but for who her father had been. But she refused to be broken. She had her father's stubborn streak, his unwavering conviction in the face of overwhelming odds. She continued to meet with the ranchers, to offer them words of encouragement and support. She worked with Dr. Vance to set up a makeshift clinic for those who could no longer afford medical care. And she continued to fight back against the smear campaign, to speak the truth even when it seemed no one was listening. The turning point came one evening at a town meeting, a tense and volatile gathering in the local church. Thorne was there, his presence a dark and ominous cloud hanging over the proceedings. He had come to make a final, public appeal to the town, to paint himself as the victim and Clara as the villain. He spoke with a practiced and persuasive eloquence, his words a carefully crafted mixture of half-truths and outright lies. He spoke of progress, of prosperity, of the bright future he had planned for Redemption Gulch. And he spoke of Clara, of the chaos and violence she had brought to their peaceful community. When he was finished, a hush fell over the church. The townspeople, their faces a mixture of fear and confusion, looked to Clara, waiting for her response. She stood up, her heart pounding in her chest, and walked to the front of the church. She didn't speak of revenge, or of justice, or of the crimes of Elias Thorne. Instead, she spoke of her father. She told them of the man she had known, the man who had taught her to love the land, to respect her neighbors, to stand up for what she believed in. She spoke of his dream for Redemption Gulch, a dream of a community built on fairness, equality, and mutual respect. And then she looked directly at Thorne, her eyes blazing with a righteous fire. "You can take our land, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice ringing with a newfound strength and clarity. "You can take our homes, our livelihoods, but you can never take our dignity. You can never extinguish the spirit of this community, and you can never, ever, erase the memory of Jedediah James." Her words hung in the air, a powerful and defiant challenge to the tyrant who had held them in his grip for so long. And in that moment, the storm broke. The fear and suspicion that had clouded the minds of the townspeople began to dissipate, replaced by a renewed sense of purpose, of unity, of hope. The battle for Redemption Gulch was about to enter its final, and most dangerous, chapter. The town meeting was a declaration of war. Clara's defiant words had drawn a line in the sand, a clear and unmistakable challenge to Thorne's authority. The time for whispers and secret meetings was over. The conflict was out in the open, and the streets of Redemption Gulch were now a battlefield. Thorne, backed into a corner, his empire crumbling around him, made his final, desperate gambit. He unleashed Black Bart Corrigan and his gang of hired guns on the town, their reign of terror a brutal and indiscriminate assault on anyone who dared to oppose him. They roamed the streets with impunity, their guns for hire now a private army enforcing the will of a madman. The small ranchers who had sided with Clara were the first to feel the full force of Thorne's wrath. Their homes were burned, their cattle slaughtered, their families terrorized. It was a scorched earth campaign designed to break their spirit, to crush their will to resist. But Thorne had underestimated the resilience of the people he was trying to oppress. The ranchers, their homes reduced to smoldering ruins, did not flee. They banded together, their shared suffering forging an unbreakable bond of solidarity. They formed a makeshift militia, their hunting rifles and farm tools their only weapons against Corrigan's gang of professional killers. The town itself became a fortress, its streets barricaded, its windows boarded up. The once peaceful community was now an armed camp, the air thick with tension and the constant, nagging threat of violence. Clara, her heart heavy with the weight of the violence she had unwittingly unleashed, found herself at the head of this motley army of farmers and shopkeepers. She was a reluctant general, her only military experience the solitary hours she had spent honing her skills with her father's Colt. But she had something that Corrigan and his men did not, a cause worth fighting for. The first major confrontation occurred at the old, abandoned silver mine at the edge of town. The ranchers, led by Clara and Brody, had set up a defensive position there, using the mine's network of tunnels and shafts to their advantage. Corrigan, arrogant and overconfident, led a frontal assault, expecting to quickly overwhelm the ranchers' amateur army. But he hadn't counted on their courage or on Clara's strategic brilliance. She had learned the terrain of Redemption Gulch as a child, had played in the very tunnels that were now a battlefield. She used her knowledge of the mine to set up a series of ambushes, to lead Corrigan's men into a deadly maze of crossfire and confusion. The battle raged for hours, the dark tunnels of the mine filled with the deafening roar of gunfire and the acrid smell of gunpowder. It was a brutal and bloody affair, a chaotic dance of death in the bowels of the earth. But in the end, it was the ranchers fighting for their homes, their families, and their future, who emerged victorious. Corrigan, his forces decimated, was forced to retreat, his reputation as an invincible killer shattered. The victory at the silver mine was a turning point, a powerful and symbolic triumph for the rebellion. It was proof that Thorne and his hired guns were not invincible, that the will of the people, when united, was a force to be reckoned with. But the victory had come at a terrible price. Several of the ranchers had been killed, their lives a tragic and profound sacrifice in the name of freedom. Dr. Vance's small clinic was overwhelmed with the wounded, his gentle hands working tirelessly to mend the broken bodies of his friends and neighbors. The weight of these deaths settled heavily on Clara. She had started this fight, and now, people were dying because of her. The ghost of her father, once a source of comfort and inspiration, now seemed to haunt her with an accusatory silence. Was this the legacy he would have wanted? A town torn apart by violence, its streets stained with the blood of its own people. Her doubts were answered by a visit from the widow of one of the fallen ranchers, a woman named Sarah. Her face was etched with grief, but her eyes burned with a fierce and unwavering pride. "My husband believed in what you're doing, Clara," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "He believed in a better future for this town, a future where our children wouldn't have to live in fear. He died for that belief, and I won't have his sacrifice be in vain." Sarah's words were a powerful and moving affirmation of their cause, a reminder that they were fighting for something much larger than themselves. They were fighting for the very soul of their community, for the right to live in a world where justice was not just a word, but a reality. The promise that had been forged in the lead and blood of the silver mine was a solemn one. They would not back down. They would not surrender. They would fight to the bitter end, no matter the cost. The final confrontation with Thorne was now inevitable, a storm about to break with a fierce and cleansing fury. The sky over Redemption Gulch wept. A cold, relentless rain fell from a bruised and battered sky, turning the dusty streets into a river of mud. It was a fitting backdrop for the final act of a tragedy that had been 18 years in the making. The storm that had been brewing for so long had finally broken, and it was a storm of fire and blood. Thorne, cornered and desperate, his empire collapsing around him, made his final, desperate gambit. He had barricaded himself in his mansion on the hill, a veritable fortress surrounded by his last remaining loyal men. From there, he had issued an ultimatum: either the town surrendered, or he would burn it to the ground. It was the act of a cornered animal, a madman lashing out in a final, futile display of power. But the people of Redemption Gulch, their courage forged in the fires of adversity, would not be intimidated. They had come too far, had sacrificed too much, to back down now. And so, on a dark and stormy night, the final battle for Redemption Gulch began. The ranchers' militia, led by Clara and Brody, stormed Thorne's mansion, their faces grim and determined, their hearts filled with a righteous fury. The fighting was a brutal and chaotic affair, a close-quarters battle that raged from room to room of the opulent mansion. The once pristine halls were now a war zone. They are thick with the smell of gunpowder and the stench of death. Clara moved through the chaos like a wraith, her father's cult a deadly extension of her will. She was no longer fighting for revenge. She was fighting for the future of her town, for the memory of her father, for the innocent lives that had been lost. Finally, she found Thorn in his study, the same room where he had plotted and schemed for so long. He was standing by the window, a glass of whiskey in his hand, his face a mask of bitter resignation. The sounds of the battle, the gunshots and the screams, seemed a world away. "It's over, Thorn," Clara said, her voice a low and steady growl. He turned to face her, a faint, mocking smile on his lips. "Is it?" he asked, his voice a silken taunt. "You may have won the battle, girl, but you've lost the war. This town will never be the same. You've torn it apart, just like your father did." "My father tried to save this town," Clara shot back, her voice rising with a passionate intensity. "He tried to save it from men like you, men who value greed and power above all else." "He was a fool," Thorn spat, his voice laced with a contemptuous venom. "And you're a fool for following in his footsteps." He raised his glass in a mock toast. "To the James family," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "May you both rot in hell." And with that, he hurled his whiskey glass at a nearby oil lamp, the fragile glass shattering, the flammable liquid erupting in a sudden and ferocious blaze. The room was instantly engulfed in flames, the curtains, the books, the expensive furniture all becoming fuel for the fire. Thorn laughed, a wild, maniacal sound that was quickly drowned out by the roar of the flames. He was a man with nothing left to lose, a man who would rather see his kingdom burn than surrender it to his enemies. Clara, her escape route cut off by the wall of fire, was trapped. The smoke filled her lungs, the heat seared her skin. It seemed as if her long and bloody quest for justice would end here, in a fiery tomb alongside the man who had destroyed her family. But then, a section of the burning ceiling collapsed, creating a small opening, a desperate and unlikely path to safety. With the last of her strength, she scrambled through the opening, her clothes smoldering, her body bruised and battered, and emerged onto the rain-swept balcony, gasping for air. Below her, the town of Redemption Gulch was a sea of upturned faces, their eyes fixed on the burning mansion on the hill. They had won. The reign of Elias Thorn was over. As the flames consumed the last vestiges of Thorn's empire, a new day was dawning for Redemption Gulch, a day of hope, of healing, of reconciliation. The reckoning was over, and the long, slow process of rebuilding could now begin. The dawn that broke over Redemption Gulch was a somber one. The rain had stopped, but the sky was still a canvas of bruised and gloomy gray. The smoldering ruins of Thorn's mansion on the hill were a stark and silent testament to the violence of the previous night, a funeral pyre for a tyrant and the end of an era. The town was quiet, the exhaustion of the long and bloody fight a heavy blanket that smothered the usual morning sounds. There were no victory celebrations, no triumphant cheers, just a profound and weary sense of relief. Clara stood on the porch of the sheriff's office, a cup of coffee warming her cold hands, and looked out at the town she had fought so hard to save. It was a town of ghosts, a town haunted by the memories of the past and the scars of the present. The price of their victory had been high, the cost of justice paid in blood and tears. She felt a deep and unsettling sense of emptiness. For so long, her life had been defined by a single, all-consuming purpose, to avenge her father's death. But now, with Thorn dead and his empire reduced to ashes, she was left with a void, a gaping hole where her hatred had once been. She had expected to feel a sense of triumph, of release. But instead, she felt only a profound sense of loss. She had won her war, but she had lost a part of herself in the process. The fires of vengeance had burned brightly, but they had also consumed a piece of her soul. Brody came and stood beside her, his face a roadmap of the long and difficult journey they had traveled together. "It's over," he said, his voice a low and tired rumble. "We won." "Did we?" Clara asked, her voice a hollow whisper. "Look at this town, Brody. Look at the faces of the people. They're not celebrating. They're mourning. They're healing," Brody corrected, his voice gentle but firm. "And that takes time. You've given them a chance to heal, Clara. You've given them back their town." He was right, she knew. But the guilt still gnawed at her, a persistent and unwelcome companion. She had been the catalyst for so much violence, so much destruction. Would she ever truly wash the blood from her hands? Her journey of redemption began with a visit to the town cemetery. It was a small, windswept piece of land on the edge of town, the final resting place of the pioneers and prospectors who had built Redemption Gulch. She found her father's unmarked grave, the barren patch of earth that had been the source of so much pain and anger for so long. She spent the day there, her hands dry and bleeding as she cleared away the weeds and rocks, as she built a small, simple monument of stones. She didn't cry. Her tears had long since run dry. Instead, she talked to him, her voice a low and steady murmur as she told him everything that had happened, as she asked for his forgiveness. In the days that followed, she threw herself into the work of rebuilding the town, her energy and determination an inspiration to the weary and downtrodden townspeople. She helped the ranchers rebuild their homes, she worked with Finch to get the newspaper up and running again, and she assisted Dr. Vance in caring for the wounded. She was no longer the outlaw's daughter, the avenging angel. She was just Clara, a woman trying to find her place in a world she had helped to create. The ashes of a corrupt and tyrannical regime were slowly being swept away, replaced by the green shoots of a new and better community. The people of Redemption Gulch, their spirits no longer crushed by fear and oppression, began to come together, to rediscover the sense of community that had been lost for so long. It was a slow and arduous process, the wounds of the past deep and difficult to heal. But for the first time in a long time, there was hope in Redemption Gulch, a hope that had been born from the ashes of a fiery and bloody redemption. The seasons turned, and the scars of Redemption Gulch began to fade. The charred ruins of Thorne's mansion were dismantled, the wood and stone used to build a new schoolhouse, a symbol of a brighter future. The fields that had been scorched by Thorne's tyranny were now green and fertile, the fruits of a hard-won peace. The town, once a place of fear and suspicion, was now a community in the truest sense of the word. People helped one another, they looked out for one another, they worked together to build a better life for themselves and their children. The ghost of Jedediah James, once a specter of a dark and bloody past, was now a celebrated hero, his name a symbol of courage, integrity, and the enduring power of the human spirit. And what of Clara James, the outlaw's daughter, the woman who had brought the storm and the cleansing fire? She did not ride off into the sunset, a solitary and mysterious figure. She stayed. She made Redemption Gulch her home. She did not become the new sheriff, or the mayor, or any other position of authority. She had no desire for power. She had seen firsthand how it could corrupt and destroy. Instead, she became the town's schoolteacher, her classroom a place of learning, of laughter, of hope. She taught the children of Redemption Gulch not just how to read and write, but how to think for themselves, how to question authority, how to stand up for what they believed in. She taught them about their history, about the dark times and the brave men and women who had fought to bring about the light. She never married, never had children of her own. The children of Redemption Gulch were her family, her legacy. And in their bright and curious eyes, she found a sense of peace and purpose that she had been searching for all her life. The legend of the outlaw's daughter, the woman who had returned from the dead to avenge her father and save a town, became a part of the folklore of the West. A story told around campfires and in saloons, a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power and a testament to the enduring strength of justice. And so, our tale comes to an end. But the story of Redemption Gulch, the story of a town that had forgotten its past and the woman who had forced them to remember, lives on. It is a story of revenge and redemption, of violence and healing, of the darkness that can consume the human heart and the light that can, in the end, triumph over all. It is a story that reminds us that even in the dust and blood of the Wild West, there is always the possibility of a new beginning. It is a story that reminds us that a single person, armed with the truth and the courage of their convictions, can change the world. It is the story of Clara James, the outlaw's daughter, and her legend will never be forgotten.